Welcome to Module 5. In this module, we'll be talking about several art movements and photography. Your assigned readings for this module are chapters 9 and 21. Of course, you're responsible for watching this video, taking notes consistently, responding to the question prompt that's posted under this lecture video in Canvas, and of course your discussion forum. And students, I want to remind you that you have to italicize or underline the titles of works of art. Quotation marks are not appropriate. They are incorrect. So please italicize or underline the titles of works of art. So in this module, we'll be discussing neoclassicism, romanticism, photography, realism, impressionism, and post-impressionism. We have a lot to cover. So let's jump right in. To begin thinking about the art movements discussed in chapter 21 about the late 18th and 19th centuries, we first must consider some contextual information, specifically that this period was characterized, is called the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. So it generally refers to this period during the late 18th century that was very influential, and it stands for this shift away from religion and myth and traditions and toward a more rational, empirical, or scientific way of thinking about life. So the great philosophers of this period thought that reason and common sense could solve human problems, and criticized the irrational limits placed on political and intellectual freedom by the church and the state. So again, these thinkers thought that human knowledge could lead to happiness. There was an emphasis on progress, self-development, societal development, and from this came a growing significance of civic duty and a renewed interest in democracy and secular concerns as well. So it's really no wonder that the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution all occur during this period, during the Age of Enlightenment. So these new values led to changes in art as well. So we're going to start with neoclassicism, which is this period of art that's most closely associated with the new political and civic values of the Age of Reason. This style crops up in the late 18th century and lasts for a little while into the 19th. There was a renewed interest in classical antiquity. Yes, yet again. So there was a kind of continuation of this Renaissance interest in humanism. There was a heavy focus on the subjects and styles of human art, of ancient art, Not only painting, sculpture, and architecture were affected by this style, but also fashion and home decor. And remember, classical styles focus or are characterized by attention to geometric harmony. Remember, we talked about the golden ratio. There's an emphasis on stable compositions and rational order. All of these qualities are in keeping with that rationality, simplicity, and the order of Enlightenment thinking. So Greece and Rome also represented ideals of political and social structures, like traditions of liberty, civic virtue, morality, and sacrifice. They were really ideal models during this kind of era of political turmoil across the world. So artworks from this period of this neoclassical style often featured heroic and patriotic subject matter, as in Jacques-Louis David's The Oath of the Horatii from 1784. So first of all, Jacques-Louis David was the leading neoclassical painter in France at the end of the 18th century, and sometimes he was called the painter ideologist. He believed that painting should be a moral act, and that subject matter should be presented so that deeds of the past or noble events from history could inspire virtuous behavior and instill patriotism and civic virtue. So it's fitting that David would strongly reject that frivolous Rococo style that we talked about, that style of the aristocracy, that style of excess. David was not a fan of it. So this painting, The Oath of the Horatii, illustrates the importance of patriotism and the nobility of masculine self-sacrifice. The legend of this story, states that the warring cities of Rome and Alba decided to try and resolve their conflict by sending representatives from each of their countries to hash out their differences. So the Romans selected the three brothers Horatius that you see here, standing before their father, swearing on their swords to win or die for their country. So this display of hypermasculinity appears in great contrast to the emotionalism of the females on the right side of the composition. Notice the strong, rigid, angular poses of those male figures, and how they contrast with the curving, soft forms of the women. So this contrast kind of visually pits Enlightenment virtues of courage, patriotism, and loyalty, as represented by the male figures, against the more emotional display of love, sorrow, and despair that the females represent. The woman dressed in white actually weeps for her fiancé, who is supposed to fight these Horatii brothers, and she also weeps for her brother, who is one of the other from the other family, from the other country rather. And the other woman was married to one of the opposing representatives, and her brother was a Horatii. So you can see why these women were upset. They had their loved ones putting their lives on the line on both sides. But neoclassicism was all about country first. And the evidence of this is in the dispassionate, controlled depictions of these brothers. They are stoic, and they're willing to put their lives and the feelings of their loved ones on the line. So while David painted this work with royal patronage, it actually ended up becoming somewhat of an official symbol for the French Revolution. So neoclassicism wasn't just a painting style, though. It was also an architectural style. It looked back to the classical cultures of Greece and Rome as well. People were particularly drawn to the clarity and the simplicity of this style after that complex ornamentation of the Rococo style. Because neoclassicism was also premised on values of morality, idealism, patriotism, It should be no surprise that in the new American Republic, Thomas Jefferson spearheaded this movement that tried to adopt neoclassicism as the national architectural style. So Jefferson looked to the 4 books of architecture by Palladio, the architect that we discussed when looking at the late Renaissance before, for inspiration. So his home, Monticello, appears to be partially modeled after Palladio's Villa Rotunda, but it was made of local wood and brick instead. So Jefferson also adopted this neoclassical style for his designs of the Virginia Capitol Building and the University of Virginia. So what about Romanticism? Like neoclassicism, Romantic artists, Romantic thought, valued freedom, but not just political freedom. They also valued freedom of thought, emotional freedom, freedom of taste, speech, and more. So this movement's generally restricted or thought to take place in the first half of the 19th century, right between neoclassicism and realism. This period represented a shift in interest and values from reason to feeling, and from the objective to subjective experience, from science to intuition. We see this flip-flopping back and forth in the way that people think, and the type of values underpinning the general way of thinking, time and time again throughout history. So this period, or thinking about the roots of Romanticism, this period was defined by an interest in what is referred to as the sublime. So this is a notion studied or explored by the philosopher Edmund Burke, who defined the sublime as feelings of awe, like something's awesome, or to be awed by something, A-W-E. So feelings of awe mixed with terror. So he observed that pain and fear provoked the most intense of human emotions, and he suggested that these feelings could also be kind of thrilling. And it was this idea that inspired so many paintings of intense storms or raging bodies of water. But really, even if there weren't intense storms or the power of nature to invoke awe and fear, or the indifference of nature, just the majesty of nature, all of those are prominent themes in Romanticism. So this work from 1805 by Joseph Mallord William Turner, or J.M.W. Turner, called The Shipwreck, is a prime example of this notion of the sublime. Many of Turner's works depict images of the sea. So in keeping with the interests of the Romantic period, Turner emphasizes the power of the elements and the total vulnerability of the humans caught in this catastrophe. Viewers are reminded of the true fragility of human nature as they witness this scene. And his quick, light brushstrokes convey his very experimental, expressive style in this work. We don't know if this painting was inspired by an actual shipwreck or a poem, though. So other subjects explored by the Romantics include the exotic, the erotic, and the fantastic. and looking towards nature, rural life, and everyday people as well, rather than the allegories and mythological subjects from the past. Romantics also departed from neoclassicism in their dedication to discussing or depicting contemporary events in their art, such as in this work on the left by the Spanish artist Francisco Goya, called The 3rd of May, 1808, created in 1814 and 15. It depicts a scene in which Napoleonic soldiers retaliate against Spanish people who sought a way to expel foreign troops from their country and therefore rebelled against the French army. So many Spanish citizens were executed for this, and that's what's depicted in this scene. This work is considered romantic not only because of its contemporary subject matter, completed only 6 years following the event, but because of its emotional portrayal. Romantics were interested in emotions rather than patriotism or inspiring civic virtue. Nature was less corrupt than human, and society, but society could be corrupt as well. So by endowing the faces of the Spanish people with these horrified expressions, agonizing, horrific expressions, Goya encouraged empathy for the Spanish people and clarified his condemnation of this kind of brutality. The strong contrast of light and dark in this image heighten that emotional drama, as well as the piles of already dead, bloody human bodies. Romantics were interested also in depicting or validating subjective experience. So it was perfectly within reason for Goya to depict this scene so brutally because he felt so strongly about his beliefs and so strongly identified with these people. So on the right, I really wanted to show you this image. I couldn't help myself. This is not in your book, but on the right you'll see Saturn devouring one of his children. This is a later work by Goya, who became increasingly pessimistic and disillusioned over time. This is one of his black paintings, a category that refers to these later works that were painted frescoes on the walls of his own farmhouse. The subject of this work is quite terrifying and disturbing. It's a very violent, grisly depiction of the mythological story of Saturn, who feared that he would be overthrown by one of his children. So he ate each one of those children upon their birth. So Saturn is the Romanized title of the Greek god Kronos, and which is similar to the Greek word for time. So Goya's Saturn is sometimes interpreted as a manifestation of the artist's own fear and despair at the passage of time. Either way, Goya's work provokes viewers with its dark emotional imagery that was well in keeping with Romanticism. Your book also explains the Romantic interest in painting landscapes and how this Romantic subject flourished in the United States, where the artist Thomas Cole founded the Hudson River School. These paintings were often made from oil or pencil sketches in the artist's studio. So your book features Thomas Cole's The Oxbow from 1836, as well as Blue Hole, Little Miami River from 1851. And the latter was painted by Robert S. Duncanson, one of the first black artists to achieve international notoriety. Unfortunately, the artist suffered from mental illness that cut his career and his life short. So the last romantic painting I wanted to you to see is one by Albert Bierstadt, called Looking Down Yosemite Valley, California. And this is a beautiful work that served to reinforce the idea of manifest destiny in the American West, which was this idea that westward expansion was the inevitable destiny of the United States. Though while it is beautiful, it's actually quite sad that paintings like these help to quiet the growing concerns with the implications of conquest, such as the displacement of Native Americans, or the ravaging environmental effects of that westward expansion. One of the main reasons I wanted to show this work specifically, though, is that this one belongs to the Birmingham Museum of Art, and the last time I visited, it was on display. So it's something that you could go see in person, and it's quite majestic. So we're going to talk briefly about photography. So we're going to talk about its inception and some precursors, its development in the 19th century, the struggle to be accepted as an art form. So we're going to start with the camera obscura. So the birth of photography is commonly thought to be in the early 19th century, but that's really only the time during which we figure out a way to capture or save an image projected by photography. So there was this, it's kind of a misconception about the invention of photography. And to fully understand what I mean, we're going to break down this word. So the word photography, if you break it down into two parts, photo means light, graph means drawing, meaning to draw with light. Or produce images with light. And then the phrase camera obscura translates to, or breaks down into dark room. So the camera obscura actually creates images. So photography, as we understand it today, is really about being able to save the image, but the combination of light and a lens actually creates images. So the camera obscura, the origins of it are a little conflated. Sometimes it dates back to a Chinese invention, sometimes it dates back to ancient Greece, but when a camera obscura was actually a dark room with a small hole in one wall. And this hole acted as a crude lens. It would project the inverted image of the scene outside onto the opposite wall. And it would help if the wall was white or a clean surface. And this phenomenon is explained by the simple laws of the physical world. I'm not going to be able to get into the weeds of that. I'm no physics major, but essentially light travels in a straight line, and so when light rays pass through a small opening, they cross each other instead of scattering or reflecting all at once. So they cross and reform as an upside down image. Early uses for the camera obscura were designed by astronomers for the safe viewing of solar eclipses. Leonardo da Vinci was actually the first to draw a diagram, an understandable diagram of the camera obscura in 1519. And later in that century, it had evolved into a portable box with lenses. And eventually, artists began to use these camera obscuras to help create landscape drawings. So here are some contemporary photographs of the images projected by the camera obscura by the Cuban artist Albert Morel. I just thought it would be interesting for you to see what this technology actually looks like. You could actually create a camera obscura in a room of your own home. You just have to know that Morel is over the small hole or opening. He's actually applied a fancy lens to create these clear images. Without the lenses, you would end up with a quite blurry image. But Morel made his own portable camera obscura initially to better understand the origins of his medium. So I just thought you might like to see those. Now, what about the birth of photography as we know it, or the ability to preserve or record the projected image? Well, there's kind of a contested history of origins. There were two people who kind of working simultaneously without knowledge of one another to how to figure out a way to preserve or save the photographic image, and that was William Henry Fox Talbot in England and Louis Daguerre in France. So around 1834, Talbot was experimenting with a process he called photogenic drawing. Basically, he coated paper with salt and a solution of silver nitrate because he discovered that paper treated this way would darken in the sun. So then he would place a leaf on the paper and place it in the sun, allow it to, quote, develop, creating a kind of precise tracing of a botanical specimen. Soon after that, he created mini cameras. So remember, camera translates to room, so tiny rooms, to try to capture the roof line, the trees around his house. And this experiment worked, but it was a negative process. So just keep that in mind. But he didn't do much else with this knowledge until he heard about Daguerre's work 4 years later. Because Daguerre was getting recognition, Talbot kind of rushed to prepare a publication with his discoveries in response. And the result was that people found his process inferior to Daguerre's. It was thought more fitting for scientific study of botanical specimens. Daguerre's work did initially have more appeal. His images were crystal clear, whereas Talbot's were not as sharply defined. And of course, they were negatives. So the process, Daguerre's process was also freely circulating because he actually sold his patent. He sold his technology to the French government. And Talbot, once his process was a little more refined, and he actually patented it, and so he was charging people to use his technology essentially. So Talbot eventually had come up with this better process, and eventually he becomes more significant or beneficial to the world of photography as we know it, because we know that we can make multiple reproductions of a negative. So it was reproducible. On paper too. Photos on paper rose to the forefront later in the century. And there were disadvantages to daguerreotypes because they were one of a kind. They were not reproducible, and they required the sitter to sit still for several minutes. They also, daguerreotypes had to be viewed at just the right angle. Otherwise, the image kind of seems to disappear and revert to a kind of mirror-like surface of the silver plate. That's another thing. These daguerreotypes were only produced on silver plates. But they kind of have this fabulous, clear, eerie quality about them. So, how did this affect the 19th century public? Well, prior to the invention of photography, only the wealthy could afford to have their portraits made or painted. But the 19th century saw an absolute photography mania. People lined up to have their portraits made. And despite long sitting times, devices were created to help sitters remain motionless, like vices for their heads to keep still. And this is one of the reasons you often see a lack of expression, like no smiles. I mean, can you imagine holding a smile for several minutes, 30 minutes? And many luxurious studios popped up in major cities. So, while the public loved photography and scientists saw the potential benefits of photography, the acceptance of it as an art form alongside painting and sculpture took a lot longer. One of the first photographers to argue for its artistic legitimacy was Oscar Rieslander. In this photograph, The Two Paths of Life, from 1857, Rieslander combined 30 negatives to create this allegory of good and evil. And an allegory is something that reveals a hidden message or meaning that's usually moral or political. But he was trying to recreate a theme commonly found in paintings. This one is loosely based on one of the works that we've studied. Do you want to take a guess? Pause. It's Raphael's The School of Athens. The central figure here is this wise old sage, and he kind of ushers these two young men that flank him into life. And on the right, we see this virtuous scene. We see religion and charity. And on the left, we see immorality. We see gambling and drinking and sex. And while this work was purchased by Queen Victoria, it was generally not well regarded. Critics said that, quote, mechanical contrivances could not make works of high art, which is a recurring criticism of photography. So the tides slowly began to shift as time moved forward. One of the first portraitists or photographers to experiment with creative and expressive portraits was Julia Margaret Cameron. She didn't receive her first camera until she was 48 years old, but she often photographed the great men and women of the British arts. Her work was more personal and way less dependent on existing forms of art than Rieslander's. She rejected sharp precision that was so popular in portrait photography because she felt it only captured the sitter's physical attributes and nothing of their inner spirit or character. She was one of the first to experiment with close-ups and soft or blurred focus. So she often depicted her subjects without props that were customary in the popular studios that were popping up across all of these towns. And so these props attempted to elevate the social status or stature of the sitters with props like classical columns, big books, drapery, and academic poses like you see here in this image on the far right. So have you ever wondered, this is just for fun, what social media might have looked like in the 19th century? Well, the carte de visite was a kind of answer to that question. These are small photographs mounted on cards used as, quote, calling cards by middle and upper classes in paying their social calls. They were really usually portraits in which the sitter would wear his best clothing and attempt to put forth his best attitude. And they were collected kind of like baseball cards or friends on Facebook. People also collected the carte de visites of celebrities as well. So, photographers were quick to discover the documentary power of photography. The medium soon became an integral part of capturing and communicating information about real life. Photographs of the Civil War were some of the first photographs taken of historical events recorded on the spot in a way that was permanent and quickly accessible. Some of the most moving of these photos included those that depicted death. While this could be regarded as simple, straightforward journalism, it could also be read as commentary about the high price of war. It's also important to note that photographs were, at this time, it was several photographs required, again, objects to be, or people to be quite still. So you couldn't really capture quality photographs amidst battle. So you often see these post-battle photographs. And sometimes the images are manipulated. O'Sullivan was known for even moving bodies to get a better composition. So facts, ideas like that really bring into question the truth or lack of truth, the artifice of photography as well. Just because it appears to depict reality does not mean that it's always unadulterated reality. So, I'm sorry. Before we get into realism, there are a few key ideas to keep in mind. While neoclassicism and romanticism started out as reactionary movements in opposition to previous art movements, neoclassicism in reaction to Rococo, romanticism in reaction to neoclassicism, by the middle of the 19th century, each of these movements had been adopted by the mainstream. They had become stale and formulaic. The Academy of Fine Arts develops, and it basically is a group of government-approved artists. And the Academy taught that great art had to exhibit very particular characteristics, like classical techniques, historical subjects, mythological subjects. And so the term or phrase academic art still used today to describe such traditional works of art. And another important term to remember before we go any further is Salon, which is the name of this official art exhibition that took place in Paris starting in 1667, but from the mid-18th century through the late 19th century, it was arguably the most prominent art event in the Western world. Artists needed to be exhibited at these to gain any notoriety, at least at first. This event, and whether or not an artist was invited to participate or whether they were barred from participating, is sometimes pivotal for understanding the contributions or the rebellions of some of the artists that we cover in this chapter. So realism is this kind of art that arose in the mid-19th century as a reaction to neoclassicism and romanticism. Realist painters rejected that academic art formula. They didn't want to depict historical or mythological subjects anymore. And instead, they wanted to depict everyday, ordinary people and events. And is this not what photography did or could do with more clarity than painting ever had? Photography kind of instigated new debates concerning what was and what was not real. Some artists were threatened by this, while others accepted it and thought of photography as a helpful supplement to making art. So realists wanted to focus on the present by depicting scenes of common life. We saw hints of this kind of work in the Dutch genre paintings of Northern Europe, during the Renaissance, like Hunters in the Snow by Peter Bruegel. But these works were kind of small. What realist painters did was enlarge the scale in order to elevate their subject matter. These artists believed that art should reveal the unvarnished truth of life. So it's very clear that many of these photographers were influenced by the impact of photography to create that sense of the unvarnished truth of life. So the largely self-taught Gustave Courbet and general social radical painted the Stonebreakers in 1849, and it was exhibited in the Salon of 1850-51. This quite large painting, it was 5 by 9 feet, depicts two men, one quite young and one aged 70, laboring to make gravel for roadbeds. These workers were of the lowest social status in French society at this time, so it's quite significant that Courbet depicts them at this large scale. It really emphasizes how much respect he has for ordinary people. And the browns and grays of this painting kind of underscore the somber and dreary nature of their labors. And also, the juxtaposition of young and old might suggest that those born into poverty are generally thought to spend their entire lives that way. This work was actually destroyed in World War II. Another prominent work by Courbet is this piece he started on right after he finished the Stonebreakers, which was also exhibited at the Salon of 1850 and 51. It was 10 by 21 feet, and it features another scene from everyday life. Specifically, it's a funeral for an ordinary citizen. Critics balked at this work because they objected to that depiction of a provincial funeral. Specifically on this scale, that was usually reserved for scenes of major historical events or narratives. Think about the Last Supper. It was 29 feet long. So to have this funeral painting of an ordinary citizen be almost as large as Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, it was unheard of. They also had a problem with the composition. Instead of a more traditional pyramidal arrangement, Courbet organized the figures into rows or lines, in effect creating a more democratic than hierarchical relationship among the figures. While Courbet was accepted into this salon, two of his works were rejected for exhibition in the Salon of 1855 on the grounds that they were too large or too coarse or socialist in nature. So he pulled all of his works from that exhibit and created his own private exhibit called the Pavilion of Realism. And he was the first artist that we know of to stage such an exhibit of his own works. So in 1863, the Salon rejected almost 3,000 submitted works of art in an attempt to mediate the frustration of the progressive artists of this period. Then Emperor Napoleon III, who I believe was Napoleon's nephew, ordered an exhibition of the rejected works. And this exhibition was called Salon of the Rejected Ones. And among these was Edouard Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. Manet's work served to exemplify realist principles, but it also functioned as a predecessor to the Impressionist period to come. Luncheon on the Grass depicts two women, one of which is nude, clearly, and two men who were clothed, partaking in a kind of picnic outing in a Parisian park. So it's consistent with realist principles in that the figures are based on real people. This painting outraged the public because it depicted one scantily clad woman bathing and one completely nude figure that the public assumed were prostitutes, and to be amongst two clothed male figures without any indication of a moralizing narrative or an allegorical statement. It was shocking in its depiction of nudity in contemporary life. And the nude in the foreground gazes at the viewer without any shame or embarrassment. Now, Manet knew his painting would stir controversy, but that's not the only reason he created it. Although his exact intention is unclear, we do know that Manet was interested in exploring the properties of painting itself. He was interested in artistic inquiry. His painting shows a deep knowledge of art history. We know this because he references history painting, portraiture, pastoral scenes, nudes, and even religious scenes. And what we mean by that is it's very clear that he knows about the art that has come before him in the composition and the subject matter, and the blending of subject matter. His painting is meant to convey this fact clearly, so that his audience knows that he's informed about traditions and therefore very intentionally breaking away from those traditions in the name of experimentation. So, in addition to its subject matter, the way the figures are executed in soft focus, the visible broad brushstrokes that depict the landscape, and the way that they contrast with the highly detailed pile of clothing and picnic basket in the front left foreground are kind of groundbreaking. The strange, harsh light that illuminates the figures gives them a stark, forceful presence. And the cool shades of blue and green permeating this picture plane also serve to flatten the figures, making them appear to stand out sharply against that background. So it's important to recognize Manet as the artist who set the stage for experimentation and the move away from illusionism, and who inspired many of the artists belonging to the Impressionist group. He also organized his own exhibition in 1867. Like Courbet, he galvanized his reputation as the leader of progressive artists by doing this. So now we move on to the Impressionists. Impressionist art really was the art of industrialized, urbanized Paris, a reaction to the sometimes brutal and chaotic transformation of French life in the latter part of the 19th century. These rapid changes made the world seem unstable. And Impressionist works are thought to reflect the efforts of artists to capture those fleeting moments, those chaotic moments. This is in contrast to the precise renderings of realist paintings, of photography. Instead, Impressionists wanted to capture that sense of elusiveness and impermanence of images and of life. Many artists painted outside, many Impressionist artists, or in plain air, so that they could more accurately and immediately record the fleeting effects of light and atmosphere on their subjects, which were most often landscapes or ordinary scenes from daily life in various seasons, times of day, and weather conditions. Impressionists were also able to figure out that color is modified by light. the quality of light. It's modified by reflections and the juxtapositions of color. This means that the colors are next to one another, juxtaposed. So they experimented with this knowledge of color, and it allowed them to present images that convey a sense of vibrating light and brilliant color. And they achieved this effect with their characteristic, quick, short, choppy brushstrokes of different pure colors. These appear incomprehensible at close range, but become kind of dazzling works of art when seen from the right distance. Claude Monet is the quintessential artist associated with this period. And it was this painting, Impression Sunrise, of 1872, that one critic harshly criticized, and that which elicited his use of the word impressionist in a pejorative way. However, the painters working in this style happily adopted that term to identify themselves. This work might remind you of J.M.W. Turner's work, The Burning of the House of Lords and Commons, a romantic painting. But Monet's work is created more as a result of scientific inquiry, of light and of color, while Turner's is an emotional response and exaggeration of an important contemporary event. In this work by Monet, the Saint-Lazare train station, we see a more urban subject. Still fits that everyday kind of subject matter, though. This new structure was made of steel and glass, and it fascinated Monet because of the way that light poured through the glass ceiling and filtered through the steam coming from the locomotives. He set up an easel in the train station and captured 12 different views of this canopy under changing light conditions. And he attempted to elevate the kind of sketch-like qualities, aesthetics of his work to the same level as, quote, completed works. But this is precisely the criticism that so many of his paintings elicited. This idea that they were unfinished. So, another prominent Impressionist painter is Pierre-Auguste Rodin, who met Monet in 1862 and was influenced by him to start working in the mode of Impressionism. He did this by combining his own affinity for figure painting with Monet's style of depicting light. So, although it may seem unrelated, we have to note here that industrialization of Paris facilitated the kinds of scenes that we see depicted by Renoir. So it created this kind of upper middle class ability to participate in leisure activities like dining and dancing and attending concerts and ballets and more. So these kinds of scenes were of interest to the Impressionist painters too. For instance, in Les Moulins de la Galette, or the Pancake Mill, we see dancers in dappled afternoon sunlight, attractive people engaged in this kind of relaxing conversation and smiling and eating. And Renoir glamorized this scene by using his young artist friends as models. Imagine an upper middle class might be a little bit older. The overall composition is very relaxed as well. We see more of that loose brushwork and experimentation with color. You might notice a liberal use of blue and purple throughout the composition, and that kind of lended a soft, natural appearance. Artists that came before thought that shadows had to be depicted in grays and blacks. Lastly, it's important to note that Renoir thought that paintings should bring joy, that they should be pretty, and he encourages us to take pleasure in them. So these two artists are also generally grouped with the Impressionists. We've already looked kind of closely at some works by Degas, so we know that his works were generally lauded for their innovative compositions. But we also often see kind of these arbitrarily cut off figures, such as the dancer on the far right, and we see intentional blurriness and splotches of light. And these are all indicators that the artist was interested in photography. He often used it for preliminary studies. He also used, the pastel drawings as preliminary studies as well. But photography, as we mentioned before, was a great tool for many accepting artists of this period. And on the right, you'll see The Boating Party by Mary Cassatt. So, and both of these are in your book. So this work by Cassatt, and then these two works, the one on the far left and the one on the far right, exemplify another important interest or influence on the Impressionists and many other late 19th century artists. And that is the influence of Japanese woodblock prints. There was a growing interest in Japanese art and culture at this time. It developed as countries of the world began to trade with Japan again, having been closed off since the early 17th century. This craze was even referred to as Japanism. In terms of art, artists were intrigued by the broad areas of flat color with a limited amount of modulation or gradation. So there was a lack of modeling here, meaning there was a lack of effort to create a three-dimensional effect. Sometimes there was a combination of these effects. So this flatness particularly interested modern painters who were seeking ways of drawing attention to the painting surface. These included Degas, Cassatt, and Manet, but also Toulouse-Lautrec, Van Gogh, and Gauguin. And you can see here that Degas' painting was inspired by this work in the middle of this slide. He actually owned works by this Japanese artist. Notice that the position of the female figures is very similar. And then Mary Cassatt's work is clearly influenced by the Japanese prints. It only shows depth or indicates depth by the angle of the furniture. And she creates the figures to be completely flat. Some elements of depth are suggested, of course, in the devices of overlapping and vertical placement, but there's no modeling. So the incorporation of pattern in the background is also common to Japanese prints, or just to include these rich patterns at all. So now we move on to Post-Impressionism, which is not a cohesive movement, but a proliferation of styles, as we've seen throughout this century. Most artists grouped in this category did have an Impressionist phase, but they grew restless with the emphasis on spontaneous recording of light and color. Although many of them did at least keep using that bright Impressionist color palette. Several of the artists associated with this movement were more concerned with creating formal order and structure in their work, and others developed more abstract and expressive styles that would pave the way for many of the modern art movements of the 20th century. So first we'll look at the two major formalists painters, starting with Georges Seurat. Seurat was dedicated to classical aesthetics, but he combined this interest with a vigorous study of optics and color theory. He came up with a process or a method of applying color, which he preferred to call divisionism, but it's most often referred to as pointillism. Now, in theory, juxtaposed dots of color would merge in the eye of the viewer to produce other colors, which would be perceived as more luminous and intense than the colors would be had they been mixed on a palette. So it's very similar to that impressionist technique of the choppy brushstrokes of pure color, but it's more exact. It's much neater. Also, he intentionally leaves extra space between the dots so that he specifically calls attention to the formal order of his work, giving it that sort of grainy texture. This work is called a Sunday, I learned it as a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. Your book has abbreviated it to a Sunday on La Grande Jatte. And it's his most famous work. And we know of more than 50 collective studies that he created before executing this final work, some of which were drawn, some of which were painted. And that's what you see on the right side of the screen here are two details from one of his painted studies of this work. Now, Cezanne is an artist that we've seen before as well when we were looking at techniques for creating depth and space. Cezanne allied himself with the Impressionists early on, but soon he found that this movement lacked form and structure to him. So he declared that he wanted to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of the museums. Do you remember how he created that sense of space by overlapping the apples? But then he confused our senses by the unclear sense of depth behind the apples. Well, he does this to some effect in many of his paintings. In Mont Saint Victoire, which he painted about 30 times in his career, that's why I've included a couple of different versions here, we see in this version here his exploration of line, plane, and color, and their interrelationships. So because we know that cool colors recede and that warm colors advance, we can begin to see how Cezanne created volume and depth in these works by applying patches of these colors next to each other very carefully. He also studied the capacity of lines and planes to create a sense of depth. Think how greatly this contrasts with the illusionism of linear perspective. We don't have orthogonals here. We don't have a clear vanishing point. We only have these patches of color that do create a sense of depth. We also see hints of atmospheric perspective in that kind of hazy blue in the very back of our depth perception of the picture plane. Or at least we do note the transition from bright colors to hazy blue. So photographs of this site reveal that Cezanne didn't necessarily model his depictions after how the scene actually looked, nor did he emphasize certain elements like the Romantic painters would have. He simply depicted the scene in accordance with the harmony that the composition of the painting itself demanded. This is to say that it developed out of the process of experimentation and exploration. We often say that he built up the picture plane with lines, shapes, and colors. So now we're going to look at the more expressive post-impressionists. And first we'll look at everyone's darling, Van Gogh, who, rather than exploring color and distorted forms to create a formal process, Van Gogh experimented with them in order to express his emotions. So we're not going to get into much about his life or personality, but I will say that there is an excellent series about him on Canopy, which you guys should all look into as students of the university. Canopy is this streaming website, kind of like Netflix or Hulu, but it's has tons of documentaries and critically acclaimed films, like we're talking high art, and you can get a free account through the university. Anyway, lots of information, films, television series about Van Gogh if you're interested in the life of Van Gogh. Now, it may be difficult to see the influence or the relation at first, but Van Gogh was very influenced by Seurat's idea set forth in Divisionism. That was all of the little dots that we looked at on the island of Grandjot. So, but rather than applying colors and dots, Van Gogh applied Divisionism by using multi-directional dashes of impasto. Or impasto means thick applications of pigment or paint. And this is what gave his work that palpable surface texture that we've mentioned before. And it also gave them a sense of energy. Van Gogh felt that his very expressive paintings could help bridge the gap between artists and viewers and provide some relief from the sense of alienation created by modern society. Don't forget that these artists are all of their time and reacting to the era in which they live as well. So we can derive, perhaps, by looking at Starry Night, that expressive paintings often bypass the appearance of reality in order to emphasize feelings instead. Now, we do know that Van Gogh was a troubled man, eventually committing suicide in 1890, and he painted Starry Night the year before he died. So we might deduce that he believed or ascribed to this popular belief of the time that after death, people travel to a star. This idea is reinforced, or at least the contemplation of reality is reinforced by the appearance of the cypress tree in the not reality, at least contemplation of mortality. It's reinforced by the appearance of the cypress tree in the foreground at the left, which was traditionally a symbol of both death and eternal life. And then we can't help but notice that dark blue throughout the painting creates a kind of pervasive, depressive mood. Now, on the top right, you'll see The Sower from 1888. Your book includes this work to illustrate the influence of Japonism on Van Gogh. And this is clear in the flat areas of color, as well as the kind of simple and bold shapes that we see. But this work also illustrates one of the artist's favorite and most adored subjects. He created more than 30 drawings and paintings of sowers during his lifetime. And essentially, a sower is a kind of farmer or agricultural worker who puts seeds in the ground. The figure of the sower represented the eternal cycle of agricultural life, and honorable work and tradition. The sun also figures heavily into these images of the sower. Its presence is almost divine or godlike in its luminosity. Now, lastly, Van Gogh worked very closely with Gauguin at this time, who encouraged the artist to focus even less on realistic imagery and more on imagination. So, presumably he did. That's why the sky is kind of a greenish yellow in that top image, and then the field is kind of purple in both images of the sower. Now we will shift our attention to Paul Gauguin, who once said to another painter, maybe even Van Gogh, don't paint from nature too much. art is an abstraction. And you'll see how he certainly applies this to his own work, which was definitely more abstract than Van Gogh's. It too, like Cezanne, was highly influential on the 20th century art movements that were to follow. And it's important to note right away that Gauguin strongly rejected what he considered the corruption of urban civilization. And as a result of this, he sought a more primitive existence and lived for extended periods in the peasant province of Brittany, and eventually in Tahiti, where he lived for many years without his wife and children. In Brittany, he was inspired to paint the Vision of the Sermon, also known or also called Jacob Wrestling with the Angel, from 1888. This painting depicts peasant women who've just heard a sermon about Jacob's encounter with the Holy Spirit. And what we're meant to derive is that these women see this kind of apparition as a result of their innocent faith, unquestioning faith. Clearly, this work could not be, or is not similar to the fleeting moments captured by the Impressionists, nor is it realist in nature. Instead, Gauguin presents a twisted perspective that utilizes memory and imagination. Gauguin didn't unify this picture with a horizon or an accurate sense of spatial depth. We understand some depth in the image because of the devices of overlapping and vertical placement and modulation of the figures' faces, but there's no sense of like deep space in this work. Instead, he abstracts the scene by painting the background in an intense flat red. And that large diagonal tree trunk, like the one we saw in the Sower, conveys that Gauguin too was influenced by Japanese prints, as well as the broad areas of flat color. And there's also a lot of symbolism in this work, such as the apple tree, which symbolizes man's ability to distinguish between good and evil, and the foliage represents promise of man's redemption and return to paradise. Gauguin actually tried to give this to two different churches, give this work of art to them, but they refused because it was thought that it might scare the members of the church. And it's important to note that symbolism here doesn't just mean iconography, as we've studied before, but also that symbolism itself is this subgroup of post-impressionism that is led by Paul Gauguin. And like Gauguin, they rejected values of rationalism and material progress and chose instead to explore emotion, imagination, and spirituality. But one more Gauguin piece before we talk about our one beloved symbolist, and that is this painting, Mahana no Atua, or Day of the God, that depicts Gauguin's ideal Tahiti, or at least more like the Tahiti he romanticized in his mind, because what Gauguin actually found in Tahiti when he moved there was a rapidly colonizing country whose native culture was disappearing under the pressures of westernization. But Gauguin ignored this for his painting's sake and depicted the fantasy of his imagination. Now, this scene is divided into 3 horizontal zones in styles of increasing abstraction. The top zone is the most realistic, and it's centered around this statue of a god, but it's the god's not even native to Tahiti. It's modeled after a figure he saw in a magazine, and this faux god is flanked by several Tahitians on a somewhat normal looking beach scene. And now in the middle zone we see these 3 bathers just below the statue, sitting on a beach of very unnatural color, that gorgeous pink color. And the central bather dips her feet in the water, while the two flanking her sides are curled up in the fetal position. Now, some interpretations suggest that these figures might represent birth, life, and death. And then the bottom zone is a very striking, abstract pool of these bright colors arranged kind of like puzzle pieces. There's a pattern of these flat, biomorphic shapes. And this magic pool seems to kind of capture the, quote, mysterious centers of thought that Gauguin sought to depict. It's a very enigmatic work. So lastly, let's talk about Edvard Munch. Munch's work is considered symbolist, meaning that his work is highly expressive and emotional, and greatly depended on the use of line, color, and other visual elements to be expressive, much like Van Gogh, but even more extreme. Munch said of this painting that he was walking along the road one night, tired and ill, and he felt a, quote, shriek passing through nature. So that's what he attempted to depict. Now, he also said that he painted the clouds to appear like actual blood. This was likely painted, well, some scholars think that he was anxious about death, or maybe that he was even agoraphobic. But it's a fabulous painting. Now, we also have the Dance of Life on the left, which is thought to, or suggested to represent the 3 stages of a woman's life. We have the naive, virginal figure on the left, wearing the white dress, who is looking forward to love. And in the center, we have the sensuous woman in the red dress who has found her partner. But we also kind of have a hint of entrapment or something negative in the way that the bottom of the dress obscures the feet of both figures, and they both seem kind of lifeless, those 2 figures in the middle. And then we have the clearly depressed figure on the right. So I just wanted to include one other work by Edvard Munch for your eyes. Now, I forgot to include in the last slide your prompt, but you are to consider the relationship between photography and realism. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture.